the discussion about Australia is really statistical malpractice. If you look at total suicides in Australia, total suicides increased by about 20% after the confiscation. And with total homicides also increased afterwards. Australia has a very high violent crime rate overall. Time after time, they'll say, I need to go to a gun-free zone because I'll be the only person with a gun and I'll be able to go and kill more people if nobody's going to be able to stop me. Why don't you separate out gun-free zones from other places to see the rate that they're stopping them? And if you do that, over 50% were actually stopped by legally armed civilians. Since 2020, we have like 50 cases where police have said if it hadn't been for the presence of a permit holder, you would have had a mass public shooting. Nobody needs to take my word for this stuff. On our website at crimeresearch.org, we list out all the cases as well as links to the underlying news stories.
Hello and welcome. My name's Topher Field. This is a Topher Project special event. My guest today is none other than John Lott Jr, a gun expert and crime prevention expert from the United States of America. For American viewers, you'll be sitting there going, yes, I'm looking forward to this. For my Australian viewers, you'll be saying, John who? Well, you're about to find out, and I assure you this interview is going to be both engaging and enlightening, especially if you're someone who's concerned about guns, gun crime, and safety. John Lott, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for having me.
The timing of this is very, very serendipitous, I think. We're going through a new phase of gun bans in Australia. The last major round was in 1996 in the wake of the Port Arthur massacre that happened there. There was some significant reforms, also significant pushback against that, but by and large, the Prime Minister John Howard got what he wanted at the time. Broadly speaking, I think the same seems to be true. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has rammed through some legislation for another gun buyback. At a state level, we're seeing a bunch more restrictions on guns being introduced. Now, we're told, and most Australians firmly believe, that this is to keep us safe, that this is why we have less gun violence, fewer mass shootings and things like that than what the US have. You have written a book titled More Guns, Less Crime, which flies in the face of the orthodoxy that most Australians would hold. What's the thesis of that book, and how in the world could you come to that conclusion?
Well, the basic notion is you make it risky for criminals to go and commit crime. You can do that with things like higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences. But you can also make it riskier for criminals to commit crime by letting victims be able to go and defend themselves. And you know, bad things happen with guns, and guns make it easier for bad things to happen, but they also make it easier for people to protect themselves and prevent bad things from happening. In the United States, people use guns defensively to stop crime about 5 times more frequently each year than guns are used in the commission of crime. And if my research convinces me of anything, it's basically the most vulnerable people in society who benefit the most from being able to go and protect themselves. Police are extremely important. But the thing is, the police themselves understand that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. In New South Wales, for emergency urgent calls, the average police response time is a little bit over 11 minutes. That's even assuming that you can go and make the call when that's occurring. And so a lot of damage, a lot of harm, even if you can make the call, can occur in 11 minutes. And so, as far as the people who benefit, my research indicates basically the people who are the most likely victims of violent crime, that in the United States to be poor minorities, particularly blacks, and also people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. Criminals like to pick victims that are relatively easy targets, that are weak. And when you're talking about a male criminal, which is usually what you're talking about, versus a female victim, there's a lot larger strength difference that exists there than when a man is attacking another man. And by far the safest course of action for a woman to take when she's confronted by a male criminal is to have a gun. Anything else where she actually has to come into physical contact, like if she had a baseball bat or a knife or something like that, if a woman gets close enough to be able to go and use those, she's pretty much lost the battle. We have something called the National Crime Victimization Survey in the United States, which surveys about 240,000 people each year, and it has really detailed data on, you know, what type of crime was involved, how the victim responded, what the outcome was, the characteristics of the criminal. And what you find is that, you know, there's a myth out there that people should behave passively when they're confronted by a criminal. There's a kernel of truth to it, but it's really statistical malpractice, because if you compare passive behavior to all forms of active resistance lumped together, passive behavior is slightly safer.
Right.
The problem is that many of those things are much more dangerous than passive behavior. So for example, for a woman, the most dangerous course of action is to use her fists because it will result in a physical response back from the attack. The second most dangerous course of action for a woman to take is to try to run away. Now, if you can run away and escape, that's great. But the problem is women tend to be significantly slower runners on average than men are. In the process of being tackled and subdued, there can be serious injuries that occur to the woman. When you know, things like using a knife or a baseball bat also turn out on net to be bad. The safest by far is to have a gun. Women who behave passively are about 2.4 times more likely to end up being seriously injured than a woman who has a gun. And so, anyway, there are lots of points I could go into there, but I can give you one simple empirical thing.
Sure.
And that is, you know, if you think on net guns are bad, there are places around the world that have banned either all guns or all handguns. You'd think then it should be very easy to find places that have banned guns where murder rates have gone down. And yet every single time either all guns or all handguns have been banned, murder rates have gone up, often by large amounts, by 3-fold, even 7-fold increases that occur right after the ban goes into effect. You think out of randomness, once or twice, a ban would have been associated with a drop or even just staying the same. But what happens is that when you have a ban, it's basically the most law-abiding good citizens who obey it and turn in their guns, and not the criminals. You may take a few guns away from the criminals, but if you're primarily disarming the victims that are there, you make it easier for criminals to go and commit crimes.
Okay, I want to interrogate that last point in just a moment. I want to rewind first. You made the mention that statistically guns are used in a defensive capacity. Was it 5 times more often than in an offensive or a criminal capacity?
Right, exactly.
I'm sorry to interrupt this interview with John Lott Jr. We'll get back to him in just a moment. My name's Topher Field. This is a Topher Field special event. It is my privilege to be able to sit down with someone like John Lott and bring his wisdom and learnings to my audience. That's you guys. If you appreciate what I'm doing, bringing you stories, news, perspectives, and interviews that you won't find anywhere else, then I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me to keep the Topher Project going. You can do that by heading to topherfield.com, buying me a coffee via the button that you'll find on the homepage. But while you're there, make sure you go to the shop. You'll find both of my best-selling books, as well as my multi-award-winning DVD, plus all of my t-shirts, hoodies, caps, and stickers, and everything you buy is going to help me to keep the Topher Project going, so I can keep bringing you more stories, news, perspective, and interviews like this one with John Lott. There is a perception, and I can understand why this perception exists, that if you have people protecting themselves with guns, you're inviting a bloodbath. Can you give us some real-world examples of where this sort of defensive gun use happens and it leads to a better outcome than what would have happened had the criminal been allowed to prevail?
Well, I mean, just first of all, about 95% of the time that people use guns defensively, they don't fire the gun. It's simply brandishing a gun is enough to cause the criminal to go break off the attack. But, you know, one of the things that the media does that I think gives people kind of the type of impression that you have there, and that is what they cover. You know, so let's say you're an editor of a news bureau and you have 2 stories that come across your desk. In one case, let's say a woman's brandished a gun, the would-be criminals run away, no shots are fired, no dead body on the ground. In another case, let's say there's a dead body on the ground. Which story are you going to cover more? I mean, is there any question about that? You know, when we've gone and looked at defensive gun use stories that are covered by the news media, over 50% of the news stories involve cases where the attacker's been killed. About 43% involve cases where the attacker was wounded, and only about 4% involve simply brandishing a gun, and most of those involve relatively unusual cases where the criminal was held at gunpoint until the police arrived. And so...
And you said 95% don't involve firing a shot, so therefore somewhere close to 95% never make the news.
Yeah, they're not even get close to being a newsworthy story. And they're not even sure what crime would have been committed in many of those cases. And so I don't blame the media for how it covers many of those cases. I don't think that explains everything. So, you know, there are lots of cases where police have said, if it wasn't for an armed civilian, it would have been a mass public shooting. They probably would have gotten international news attention. You have cases, for example, you know, the Parkland school shooting, I suspect. just shortly after that, nearby in Florida, in Titusville, Florida, there was an attack at an elementary school. They were having a big to-do, get an event. Hundreds of parents, hundreds of students, teachers were in a park right next to the school. A man came up, started firing. A man with a permanent concealed handgun stopped him, wounded him, and nobody was killed.
Yeah.
One can only imagine if it had been inside a school and guns weren't allowed there, what would have happened. And after the sensitivity with Parkland, it would have surely gotten massive news attention. The Parkland case was getting coverage for years after, but this is just I could go through many cases like this, where on our website at crimeresearch.org, just since 2020, we have like 50 cases where police have said if it hadn't been for the presence of a permit holder, you would have had a mass public shooting.
Okay, there'd be many people sitting here thinking, well, yes, but if you didn't have guns in the first place, there wouldn't have been a shooter to stop. You made mention a moment ago that in every single case, it's a very absolute statement you made, in every case where guns have been banned, the number of murders have gone up. I don't want to misrepresent. Is that,
Yeah,
is
no,
that
that's
correct?
true.
So a counter to that would be the issue of jurisdictions. So if a US state, for example, reforms gun laws and were to try and ban a bunch of guns, they can, of course, come in from other states and cross state lines. How do you respond to the idea that it's the states with liberal gun laws that are then causing the crime, even in the states that have strict gun laws?
Right. Well, I mean, we have had jurisdictions in the United States that did try to put gun bans in. We had Chicago and Washington, D.C. Murder rates went up in those places. And people made the type of argument that you're saying, that people can go get guns from the rest of Illinois or Indiana or Maryland or Virginia. You know, first of all, that doesn't explain why it went up. It may explain why it didn't go down, as they were predicting, because people can get guns from those other places to begin with. And, you know, it would have been nice if they had told people beforehand it's going to fail when they were pushing for the laws to begin with. But those aren't the only experiments. We've had island nations go and pass gun bans, which would kind of be, you know, the ideal experiment. You know, Solomon Islands, not too far from here. You have Jamaica, you have the Republic of Ireland, you have the UK that have had gun bans. And after each of those, you saw large increases in murder and homicide rates. In the 8 years after the UK had its 1997 January handgun ban, the homicide rate went up 50% over the next 8 years. Now, eventually it went down, but it's only after they had, over a 2-year period of time, a 14% increase in the number of police officers, over 4 years, an 18%, because people were so upset about the rise in crime that was there. And police are exploring. You have an 18% increase in the number of police in a short period of time. That's going to deter some crime that's going to be occurring. But even with that, it only kind of got it back down to the level it was before the ban that was in place. And, you know, Jamaica saw a several-fold increase that occurred right after, in murders, right after the gun ban went into effect. Similar with Ireland. And, you know, you just think out of randomness, once or twice, when you have bans, whether it be an island nation or a country or whatever, that you would see murder rates at least stay the same. But yet every single time it goes up.
So Australian listeners will be listening to you right now thinking, but hang on, we effectively banned almost all semi-automatic rifles and a bunch of other kinds of rifles in 1996. We didn't see a rise in gun murders following that. So they would take that as de facto evidence that removing the guns has improved the murder rate. But you're saying that in every single case, murders have actually gone up.
Right,
so what's the Australian case?
Okay, so I really think the discussion about Australia is really statistical malpractice. You know, and one problem that you have with Australia is that you don't have kind of academics who are willing to kind of go and push back against a lot of these numbers that are there. They should understand some of the problems with the way things were done. So a lot of the discussion, or basically all the discussion, as far as I can tell, in Australia, involves simple before and after comparisons of crime rates. You know, that may be fine for newspapers in some sense, but let me give you a simple example. let's say you had a perfectly straight line that was falling over the entire period. You could pick any point along that perfectly straight line, and the after average is going to be below the before average that's there.
Okay.
But if it's falling at exactly the same rate before and afterwards, I'd look at it and I say, well, you changed the law. It was falling before at a certain rate. It's falling after at exactly the same rate. I would say, it's not really obvious it had an impact. What you'd want to look at is it falling at a faster rate? Is it falling at a slower rate?
Sure.
Is there some type of discontinuity that was occurring in the line? And with Australia, people want to focus on firearm homicides and firearm suicides. What you find is that for the 15 years before the confiscation in 96 and 97, firearm homicides and firearm suicide rates were falling.
Right.
When the confiscation went into effect, firearm homicide rates actually stopped falling for about 8 years. So I look at that and I say, it's falling, it stopped falling. I mean, you'd hope it would fall at a faster rate, or at least at the same rate that it was beforehand. And, so I look at that and it seems like it's contrary. Or firearm suicides continued falling, but at a slower rate afterwards. But there are other problems that you would think any real academic would go and look at. And that is, for example, why not look at total suicides or total homicides? There are lots of different ways people can commit suicide. If I get rid of guns, in fact, since we're talking about other countries, every place in the world that's banned either all guns or all handguns, while they will see drops in firearm suicides, see no change in total suicides.
So this is method substitution.
Right.
Someone simply chooses to do the
There's
same
so
thing
many
a different way.
Exactly. There's so many different ways people can go and commit suicide. And if you look at total suicides in Australia, total suicides increased by about 20% after the confiscation. Now, I'm not going to go and argue that the confiscation caused an increase in total suicide.
Sure.
But it sure as heck is inconsistent with the fact that somehow it reduced suicides that were going on. And with total homicides also increased afterwards. And so, I look at it and it's kind of hard for me to see a benefit. And there's a third thing that you would hope academics or others would be pointing out here, and that is look at the pattern of gun ownership after the confiscation. You had an immediate 29% drop in gun ownership right after the confiscation. But then people were able to go and buy guns again after that. By at least 2010, if not earlier, the gun ownership rate in Australia was above what it was prior to the buyback. And so if the gun control people are correct, what you should see is an immediate sharp drop right when the confiscation occurred, and then over time an increase.
Yeah.
And there's nothing that shows that that's the case. And so, in fact, the main thing, if you look at armed robberies actually had a sharp increase and then gradually went down over time after that. It's really hard for me to look at the Australian data and see that it comes anywhere near to justifying the claims that people make with regard to it.
We've just seen the tragedy of the Bondi shooting, which obviously made international news. This is exactly the kind of event that the 1996 gun ban confiscation was supposed to avoid, because we were told that it was semi-automatic rifles that made that possible. The Bondi shooting was carried out with a mix of various straight pull or bolt action or other types of weapons that were not themselves semi-automatic, and 50 people either lost their lives or have been injured in that shooting. This is now being used to say, well, now we have to restrict even further, because clearly these shootings can still happen even with the sorts of weapons that were deemed safe or safer in 1996. The response is now more gun bans. Are you proposing that Australia and other jurisdictions like Australia should actually be looking more at the American model as a better way of ensuring public safety?
Well, I think there are things that America does right and things that we could do better with regard to this. Look, we have mass public shootings in the United States. You have mass public shootings in Europe and other places. Just as an aside, if I were to go and ask you, since, let's say, 2010, can you tell me where the 2 worst mass public shootings have been?
I'm the wrong person to ask, because I've known that answer for some years. But yes, it's the Bataclan Theatre in France and, of course, Anders Breivik.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You had 130 people killed at the concert shooting in France and 67 killed in Norway. But what people don't appreciate is because the media refuses to cover the parts of the diaries and manifestos where these mass murderers explain why they pick the targets that they do. And I have to say, it's probably one of my biggest pet peeves because they'll go and talk about the diaries and manifestos and they'll say things like, well, the guy was talking about other mass murderers.
Sure.
And he was, but he was talking about it in terms of what he could learn from them. And so time after time, they'll say, I need to go to a gun-free zone because I'll be the only person with a gun. I'll be able to go and kill more people if nobody's going to be able to stop me. And about 93% of the mass public shootings in the United States have occurred in places where guns are banned. And these guys may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. They're overwhelmingly suicidal, and they want to get media attention. And they know the more people they kill, the more media attention that they're going to be able to get. And they know if they go to a place where their victims aren't going to be able to go and defend themselves, they go and kill more people. In most of the United States, you're able to go and carry a gun without any problem. The attacks overwhelmingly occur in those tiny areas within the states where people aren't allowed to carry. And to kind of get back to your point, the irony that we have here is that you have a government law that creates a gun-free zone. We haven't always had those types of rules. And then the killers choose those places. And the response is, rather than saying, let's get rid of the gun-free zone, they want to have more and additional regulations that are there. You mentioned the attack in France. France, if anything, has had stricter gun controls than Australia has had. Didn't stop that. Germany's had a number of mass public shootings. On a per capita rate, their school shootings are more than the United States. They have extremely strict gun control that's there. And, the problem that you face is that if somebody wants to go and kill people, they plan these attacks long in advance. In the United States, you basically don't find attacks that are planned for like less than 6 months in advance. Some of them are planned for years in advance. If somebody's planning something 6 months or 2 years in advance, there's so many different ways that you can go and kill people. You have like the Nice, France truck attack where 80 people were killed and hundreds were wounded.
500 if I recall.
Yeah, right. And so
the Madrid bombings, the trains, that's another one that comes to mind.
Yeah, so there's so many different ways you can go and hundreds died in that one. And so I don't know, the problem that you face with many of these laws is that it's going to basically be the most law-abiding good people who you're going to disarm. So in Minnesota, we had a school shooting in September. 2 people were killed, 17 people were wounded. If you or I were to take a gun onto school property, it's a 5-year prison sentence.
Even if it's unintentional, if you just carry it on.
Right. I mean, maybe you can get some leniency there, but you still face the 5-year prison term. And you're supposed to know the law. It's just ignorance of the law isn't going to be a defense on that case. And so for you or I, a law-abiding citizen, our life would be completely destroyed by doing that. But let's say you're the attacker. And let's say most of these attackers die at the scene. But so it's not even relevant for the criminal penalty.
5 years in prison doesn't matter if you're dead.
Right. But let's say he had lived. And he'd be facing life sentences for the murder. He'd be facing overall many more life sentences for the 17 people he wounded. You may be talking about 5 or 6 life sentences that are there. Does taking 5 years away from his 6th or 7th life matter to him? It's not relevant. He's not going to be alive in his 6th life. And so what you've ended up doing unintentionally, I understand the desire. We just want to ban guns and they'll make places safe. But if anybody reads, I mean, I forced myself to read the diaries and manifestos for these mass murderers, but time after time after time, they explain why they pick the targets that they do. And I just don't understand. Somebody needs to explain to me why the media doesn't consider that newsworthy to learn from these guys. Don't people care about why these guys are picking the targets that they do? I would hope that people would care about that, but the media just refuses to cover those, even though they mention it time after time.
You said something a little while ago that will have shocked a lot of people, and it's probably still bugging quite
Just
a few
one
viewers
thing that
now.
I said that.
There's probably quite a lot more. You said that Germany has a higher per capita rate of, I'm going to try and get this precisely right,
School shootings.
of mass school shootings or just school shootings?
Mass
Casualty school shootings.
Right.
Now, that flies in the face of so much. The media narrative that we hear here in Australia is that there's a US school shooting just about every day, if not certainly every week. There are so many lobby groups in America. I can't think of their names right now, but the various gun reform lobby groups, mums.
Demand action, right.
Yeah, all these sorts of different groups. There is a perception that at a minimum every single week a school's being shot up in America. How could it possibly be true that there are more mass casualty school shootings in Germany?
Okay. If you define a mass public shooting as 4 more people killed.
Which was the FBI definition a little while ago. Yeah.
Right. In the United States, since 2000, there have been 9 of them. Okay.
Sorry. Since 2000, we're talking 25 years.
Right.
There have been 9
Right.
school shootings that have exceeded 4 fatalities.
Right.
That is so contrary to the perception that we are given here in Australia, and I would imagine by lobby groups in the US as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, you may have, if you see the data that's put together, they'll include things like somebody who drove into a parking lot at 2 a.m. in the morning and committed suicide with a gun. Or you'll have 2 drug gangs fighting it out on the street next to the school or whatever. But, if you're actually talking about somebody coming into a school with the notion of just trying to shoot up people, those are pretty rare, at least in terms of the total. And so Germany, over that same period of time, has had 3. But the thing is, the United States has over 340 million people. Germany has about 84 million people. So the United States is about 4 times more. And so if you put it on a per capita rate, nobody is going to compare the number of murders in the United States versus Australia, right? You have 27.4 million people here. We have 340 million people.
Yeah.
Now, we may have a higher rate, we do, in terms of murders, but you'd still put it in per capita terms that are there. And so if you did that with Germany, they would have the equivalent of 12 mass public shootings.
Yeah, right.
And, you have countries like Finland, for example. Finland's had 2 mass public school shootings since 2000, but they have a population of 5.5 million. So that's like 1/60th the population of the United States.
Sure.
And so that would be the equivalent per capita as if the United States had had 120 school shootings. Countries like Russia, Norway, other countries, when you put it in per capita rates, have much higher rates of mass public school shootings than the United States.
Hey guys, sorry again, but I have to do it because, hey, I've got bills to pay. My name is Topher Field, this is the Topher Project, and this is a special event interview. I'd really appreciate it if you'd help me to keep making content like this. I do hundreds of videos every year, and I'd love to do hundreds more in 2026. You can help me to keep going by buying me a coffee via the button that you'll find on the homepage of topherfield.com, and take a moment to check out the shop. You'll find my best-selling books, my multi-award-winning DVDs, and all of my merch, and of course, everything you buy is going to help me to keep bringing you news, stories, perspectives, and interviews like this one. I noticed Switzerland seems to be absent from that list.
Well, Switzerland has had some, not school shootings, but they've had other mass shootings. And when they have occurred, they've occurred in government buildings where they have gun bans.
Guns are banned.
Yeah.
So they still, I believe, have a requirement for firearms to be owned in households?
If you actually look at gun possession rates, Switzerland has been a much higher gun possession rate than the United States did. For a long time, if you were in the militia, you would be given a machine gun, in many cases a handgun that you would keep at home. And to me, it seems, rather than the government technically owned the guns.
Sure.
Until at least you were 65, you could keep on re-enlisting in the militia up until 65. And at age 65, you were given the option to then go and buy the gun that you had had. And, it seems to me gun possession is much more of an important indicator there than just ownership of the guns.
Sure.
Israel's another country where you have that same type of thing. They probably have a higher gun possession rate than the United States has had. But there have been some mass public shootings in Switzerland, but they've occurred in government buildings where guns have been banned. So you have the same type of thing that goes on there in terms of these attackers, may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid.
You mentioned the murder rate. Now, the murder rate has actually come down to historic lows in the United States recently, as I know you're aware. I believe actually the lowest since records began in 1900.
Right.
If the provisional numbers do get confirmed, I believe that will be the case. But that still remains around about 4 people per 100,000, as compared to Australia, where we have 1 murder per 100,000 approximately. So
Yeah, I think it's more closer to 2.
is it? Okay, I did just have a look at it before to check, but it is significantly
Yeah,
lower.
no, I agree. It's
And
much different.
many people would take that as prima facie evidence that our gun bans work, that our gun culture being different is what's saving those lives. How would you explain that difference?
Well, look at the UK, for example. There's an excellent book by historian Joyce Lee Malcolm, Guns and Violence, that was published by Harvard University Press. And in 1900, before there were any gun control laws in the UK, the first gun control laws were 1920 that were there. London, a greater metropolitan area that had like over 8 million people, had 2 gun murders.
Yeah, right.
No gun control at all. If you want to do something fun, go pick up old copies of the Sunday and Lundy Times. And they had gun advertisements for everything. They had walking stick guns. They had briefcase guns where you could click on the handle and it would fire a bullet out of the briefcase.
It's like get smart kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And they have all sorts of crazy ads like that.
Yeah.
They had 5 armed robberies in London in 1900. I can't even get my mind around how you can have 8 million people, gun ownership really widespread, and have 2 murders with the guns. And when they did pass their gun control laws in 1920, it had nothing to do with crime. What had happened was you had just had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And you had this high unemployment rate, all these soldiers who had come back from war who were unemployed, and they were worried that they would have their own Bolshevik revolution. So they passed gun control laws that essentially required fees and stuff to make it so that relatively lower and middle income class people couldn't afford to own a gun. And so, the people that they were most worried about possibly staging a revolution, but it had nothing to do with crime. And so we've had 3 major gun control laws in the UK. You had in 1920, 1956, and January 1997.
Okay.
And after each of those, the murder rate went up. And, obviously it's still lower than the United States.
Sure.
A lot of people would go and say, well, look, the UK has a low homicide, low murder rate compared to the United States. It has very strict gun control laws, so it must be that caused it. But I would just say, look, it was even lower before they had the strict gun control laws that were there. And so the point is, there was something different about the UK in 1900, all right? And there are lots of different things that vary across places. What you want to try to do is, and one of the reasons why I phrased the initial thing, if you have a ban for that place and you compare the before and after averages, how does it change relative to what it was? And you just don't pick one place, so you look at that. You look at lots of places and just see, do I see a pattern across all these different places when they go and do the ban? I know for like newspaper discussions, they just have what we'd call purely cross-sectional comparisons, but you really can't control for many things in that situation.
So we've touched on the difference in the murder rate, but many Australians would have the perception that Australia is a much safer country than the United States. The belief, particularly when it comes to things like violent crime, things like rapes, breaking and entering, armed robbery, the likelihood of being held at a weapon or held with a weapon would be much lower in Australia. You've actually published research that directly contradicts that. Can you break that down for us?
Right. Yeah, no, Australia has a very high violent crime rate overall. And so here's the deal. There's basically 2 types of crime data that you have. You have crimes reported to police, all right? And then you have the Australian Bureau of Statistics has a survey where they go and ask people, have you been a victim of a crime?
Sure.
Okay, and the thing is, a lot of crimes aren't reported to police. The Australian Bureau of Statistics says for like rapes and sexual assaults, only about 19% of those are reported to police.
So 81%, 4 out of every 5 instances
Are not reported.
simply not reported.
Right.
They're only picked up because this active survey is done.
Right, exactly. And the media, for some reason, in Australia only focuses on crimes that are reported to police
Right.
and not this measure of total crime. We've known for a long time that a lot of crimes aren't reported to police.
Sure.
And, you know, whether they're reported or not depends upon things like whether people think the guy will be caught and punished or not. It can also vary how costly and difficult it is to report crimes over time. I would guess someplace like during COVID, my guess is people probably reported even fewer crimes during that period of time. And we could go into things there for that. But so for rapes and sexual assaults in the United States, about 45%. So if I were just to say I have one country where only 19% are reported, and the other one with 45%, I wouldn't want to go and compare just reported crimes in those two places because I'd be missing out a lot more crimes in the 19% country. And and there are even issues with the survey that the Australian Bureau of Statistics does, because in the United States we have a similar survey, but that goes and tries to figure out the number of crimes. So if I was burglarized, let's say 3 times over the course of the year, they would count those as 3 different events. In Australia, they just say, basically, have you been burglarized?
Right.
So you may have been burglarized multiple times, but it would still only count as one case there.
I see.
But even if you just compare that, even though it's obviously biased down in Australia, the burglary rate in Australia is like 3 times higher than the burglary rate in the United States.
Wow.
And if you adjust for the fact that, you know, people live in certain areas that may be burglarized more frequently, so somebody may have been burglarized more than once, you're talking about a ratio that's even much worse than that. There used to be something called the International Crime Victimization Survey. The UN took it over and basically killed it. But the last time they did that was in 2005. And the really nice thing about that was it was a large survey that made sure that they asked the exact same questions across the different countries. And also they defined the crimes exactly the same way for people that they were asking. And at that time, Australia's violent crime rate was about 75% higher than the US violent crime rate.
And roughly when did that end, or when did that?
That was 2005.
About 2005, so 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. So data integrity has come up quite a lot in our conversation here. You've got concerns around the way that statistics are kind of analysed and not being properly interrogated in the Australian media landscape and even within our academia. Reporting even of actual crimes and crime rates are questionable. I note also, and you spent some time at very high levels of the Department of Justice of the United States under Trump's first term as the US president. The FBI are popularly widely regarded as the authority on US crime. This is, if you've got the FBI database, then you've got the real numbers, you've got the right numbers. Your role in the Department of Justice caused you to develop, I'm just going to say, a dim view of the statistics and the accuracy. Can you share that with us and help us to understand some of the actual data reliability challenges that you've had trying to do your work at the Crime Prevention Research Center?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've worked in the federal government twice. I was chief economist for the United States Sentencing Commission in Washington, and I could tell you stories from when I was working there. And also, I worked more recently, I was senior advisor for research and statistics in both the Office of Justice Programs and then the Office of Legal Policy in the Department of Justice. And, you know, unfortunately, I think there's a lot of areas where politics affects the data that gets put out there. I don't believe the hate crime data at all that comes out of the government. There's issues like we've talked about shootings. The FBI puts out a report each year on so-called active shooting attacks. One of the jobs I had when I was in the Department of Justice was to go and look at that. And it was amazing to me. I mean, I could just see immediately looking at their cases that they were missing cases where civilians had used guns to stop the attacks.
Right.
So if you look at the period of time from 2014 through 2024, I've been updating it since I left the government. Um, the FBI claims that about 4% of active shooting attacks were stopped by legally armed civilians.
Sure.
I think it's 36%. But more than that, one of the arguments I had when I was at the FBI, I said, look, guys, you're talking about whether a law-abiding citizen can go and stop these attacks. And you can't expect a law-abiding citizen to carry a gun into a gun-free zone where it's a crime for them to be doing it.
Sure.
And so what I tried to argue is that, look, why don't you separate out gun-free zones from other places to see the rate that they're stopping them? And if you do that, you in fact find over those 11 years that over 50% of the active shooting attacks in places where they were legally allowed to carry
Sure.
were actually stopped by legally armed civilians. And but I got nowhere with that. They were just not interested in making that change with the data. And even when you could go and get them to admit that they had missed a case, years later they still haven't fixed it. And these are data that's used by the media, it's used by academics, it's used in court cases. You can very frequently find legislative debates that rely on this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's really disappointing because they basically fought tooth and nail against releasing the report that I had done while I was at the Department of Justice. Nobody needs to take my word for this stuff. We, on our website at crimeresearch.org, we list out all the cases as well as links to the underlying news stories so people can go and check themselves to make sure that, in fact, they meet the FBI definition of what an active shooting is. And, the kind of the disappointing thing is, I would have talked to like somebody from the Associated Press or something like that. And I would explain this stuff to them and they would just ignore it. They'd write up the FBI stuff and I'd write them or I'd talk to them later and I'd say, I just don't understand. And they'd say, well, we're accurate. We're reporting the FBI stuff. And I said, well, I understand you're just reporting it, but can't you check the cases yourself? I mean, you don't need to check them all, but just check some of them and just convince yourself that they've missed cases that they should have included by their own definition. And when you go, I got the Washington Post, for example, to go and Glenn Kessler used to do the fact check. He did a story on my research on this. The Washington Post is kind of a left-leaning publication.
Sure.
The FBI wouldn't answer his questions with regard to the cases that were there. And the people that they had hired, some of them from Texas State University, Glenn gave them like 200 cases that I said that they'd missed. They came back with 2 of them that they said shouldn't have been included. And, I basically said, well, these are otherwise identical to other cases that you have included, with the one difference is that a civilian stopped the attack.
Sure.
And so anyway, it's just frustrating.
So for the sake of clarity, you said there that the FBI will say that about 4% of shootings are stopped by a civilian, a good guy with a gun, so to speak.
Of active shooters.
And your research, based on actual examples that you've found, but the FBI have refused to incorporate, you put that number at 36%, and then, as you said, higher if you exclude gun-free zones. And that sort of, that's an extraordinary delta between those two.
Well, I just to emphasize it more, in the last 2 years, in 2023 and 2024, the FBI claims that there's not one single case where a legally armed civilian stopped an active shooting example. In 2024, we think it's like 45%. And if you exclude gun-free zones, it's actually over 60%.
Wow.
And so 60% is a lot different than 0. And, it's just...
John, I'd like to get deep into the weeds with you before we run out of time. In the US, we've seen President Trump recently remove the $200 tax that's been associated with NFA items. These are things like suppressors or short-barreled rifles, these sorts of things. I believe it's been since the 1930s this has been in place.
Yeah.
The removal of the tax has had the effect of a constitutional challenge now being brought against the existence of the NFA to begin with. If you go back in history, and I know I'm not teaching you anything, but for the sake of viewers, was on the basis that it was a taxing
Right,
act, that it
exactly.
was actually given the stamp of approval by the Supreme Court back in the day in the first place. What's your take on this? Do you think that Donald Trump has either deliberately or inadvertently actually killed the NFA? Was that the entire point in the first place, or is there more to it?
Well, I think since the entire justification was as a tax, and the registration was simply to go and make sure that people had paid the tax,
Sure.
I think there's a good chance that they can win the case there. Now, it's interesting just kind of understanding the legal system. The Trump administration is continuing to enforce the rules right now. And in fact, they're in court defending the NFA.
Yeah, right.
But the reason why you have to do that is if they were to stop doing that, then the case would be moot and you wouldn't get any court decisions that would be doing it. If I had to guess what's going to happen is, and I have no special knowledge that I can attest to, is that they will continue defending it up until it gets to the Supreme Court, and then maybe switch at that point.
Yeah.
And because if you win a lower court decision, cutting it down, that really doesn't have long binding precedent
Sure.
that's going to be there until the Supreme Court decides it.
So moving to another much more controversial instance, we've seen the shooting by ICE agents of two different Americans recently, both of which have made enormous international news and have sparked protests and so forth. These are very, very controversial shootings. In the case of Alex Preddy, what we've seen is remarks being made around you shouldn't bring a gun if you're going to be, to a protest, if you're going to be around federal officers. This kind of sentiment, which was expressed by some fairly senior members of the Trump administration, seems to fly in the face of their other statements that they're supporters of the Second Amendment, they're supporters of gun rights. How do you see this playing out? Is there a chink in the armor, so to speak, of the Trump administration's defense of the Second Amendment?
Well, I think they've backed away from those initial statements. I think, kind of in the heat of the moment. Look, Preddy was an idiot. I mean, I don't know how else to say this, but it's just, do I think it's okay for somebody to bring a gun to a protest? Yeah, if he's for self-defense. But he basically broke all the rules that you have for carrying. One, he interfered with the officers that were there. Two, when they tried to arrest him, he physically struggled with them. He disobeyed orders that was there. And, here he has a gun sticking out of the back of his waistband there. And, we have all these people that kind of watch the video slow motion over and over again to kind of figure out what's going on. The officer there, they have literally a second or two to go and make a decision on this type of thing. If you take a concealed carry class in the United States, and there's like 21 million Americans with a concealed carry permit, and you have 29 so-called constitutional carry states that are there, so, where you don't even need a permit to carry. So, if you take a concealed carry class, what they'll tell you is follow the rules. If a police officer stops you for speeding, tell him you got a gun, okay? If he tells you not to reach for the gun, don't reach for the gun that's there. Basically obey the rules. If you think the officer is doing something wrong, you litigate that in court later on.
Sure.
You don't get into a struggle with the officer right there at the time. And Preddy, I can't prove this, but my guess is the officers knew who he was. They've been identifying who the people, and they've had multiple interactions with him. There's video that's come out that the BBC has put out showing that how just a week earlier he was assaulting police officers. He was damaging.
He kicked a car hard enough to remove the rear light. That's not a small
Right. Well,
kick.
all those are crimes they're doing. The irony is he wasn't arrested for those earlier things that he was doing. If he had been, maybe he'd still be alive today, even if he had posted bail. If I post bail for felony assaults on officers, I would imagine I'd be a little bit more careful to go and break the conditions for the bail there by assaulting an officer again at that point. And the same thing with Renee Good. She's somebody who all that day had been interfering with ICE officers, blocking their cars. Apparently she'd been doing it for like a week beforehand. And at that point, on that fatal day, the officers just had enough. And one officer came up to the side of her vehicle and basically asked her to get out, saying that they were going to arrest her at that point. And it was at that point that she backs up a little bit and then goes forward and hits the officer that was standing in front of the vehicle. He ended up having internal bleeding. And by the way, that officer had 6 months earlier been dragged by a car where he had gotten 33 stitches in his leg. But just to give you an idea of the difficulties these officers are doing, in 2025, there was a 1,347% increase in assaults on ICE officers. There was an 8,000% increase in death threats against them. And there was a 3,200% increase in motor vehicle attacks on ICE officers. And the big thing with Minnesota, and the reason why they've had these problems there, is that the police there have refused to go and do their job, to go and protect the ICE agent. We have plenty of other very liberal communities in the country. You have like Austin, Texas, and places like that. But you haven't seen the same problems because the police in those areas will go and protect the ICE agents that are there. And so you don't get it devolved to this. Maybe if people thought that police would arrest them, they wouldn't be out doing the types of interference. I have no problem with people protesting. But if you go and interfere with these officers, the amazing thing is the quality of the job that the ICE officers have done, despite these difficulties that they have there. And so last year, they detained about 600,000 people. And a lot's made about mistakes. So like one thing, ProPublica, for example, which is kind of a left-wing media organization, will point out that 170 of the people detained were American citizens. What they ignore is that 130 of those were people that were detained because they had assaulted or interfered with ICE officers. So you have 40, it'd be better if it was 0.
Sure.
But most of those were detained for less than a day, and most of those were just detained for an hour or 2 hours, while they were being checked because they were picked up with some criminal illegal that they were riding with a car with or something. And but you can compare that to the Obama administration.
Sure.
The Obama administration only kept data for the last 2 years of the Obama administration on this, but the error rate per detainee. So for Trump, it was about 1 American citizen picked up for every 15,000 illegal aliens that were picked up. For the Obama administration, it was 1 American citizen picked up for every 4,440 illegal aliens. So the error rate was essentially 3 times higher under Obama. And he didn't have any of these difficulties that are occurring right now with the protests and stuff.
So just to round out that question, you don't believe that Trump is backing away from his support for the Second Amendment? You believe that that was a temporary aberration in the heat of the moment?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, God only knows, you see a problem. Who knows whether people think through everything that they're thinking about. What I care about is kind of what happens in the long run. There's probably more important things than whether or not somebody can have a gun with them while they're protesting or not. But I don't think it tells you anything deep. This administration has been the strongest supporter of self-defense of any administration that I know of in my lifetime. And it's more just for the Bill of Rights as a whole. I've never seen an administration that has consistently appointed judges, for example, to the courts, who, whether it's the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or the rest of the Bill of Rights, most strongly support the Bill of Rights.
Just 2 more questions for you. We've just been talking a little bit about attitudes towards gun ownership in America, the defense of the Bill of Rights from the current administration. What's the current trajectory of gun ownership in America? Obviously, famously have the highest gun ownership rates in the world already. Are new people buying more guns? Are there more people getting permits in the states that require them? Or is it shrinking? And what's the demographic where it is growing?
Right. Well, it's an excellent question. So the thing is, as I was talking about earlier, if you talk about gun possession, okay, as opposed to ownership, the United States isn't near the top. Switzerland and Israel have higher gun possession rates. The claims about the United States with regard to our gun ownership rate basically comes from something called the Small Arms Survey, which is something that George Soros helped funded. And I have gone through their reports, and they have these footnotes, and of the 108 countries that they have data for, that they claim, the footnotes only mention sources for 24 of the countries.
Wow.
And most of those are from a survey back in like 2005.
Wow.
And so I'd call and I'd ask them over. I gave up after a couple of years, just saying, "Well, give me your sources for this," and they don't do that. And I've found we've been putting this together. We're not finished with it yet, but they're off by factors of 10 in some countries because countries have licensing rules. Most countries, and so you can find out how many people legally own a gun there.
Sure.
And so it's just a joke, the claim. And so I could go through individual countries, but your real question that you have there about the changes. So right now, the only hard data we have in the United States on gun ownership are the concealed carry permits,
Okay.
and that had been increasing up until a few years ago, and it started to fall, but that's only because now we have 29 constitutional carry states
When
where
no
it's no
permit
longer
required.
right.
Mhm.
And so the actual rate that people are carrying has actually been increasing,
Sure.
even though the number of permits have fallen slightly, not by very much. And but the big thing in terms of the demographics has been you've seen a huge increase in carrying by women and blacks. And I think that that's great news because if my research convinces me of anything, what we were talking about at the beginning of the interview is that those are basically the people who benefit the most
Yeah.
from being able to go and protect themselves. And so I think it's finally information's finally gotten out to people. If you look over the last decade, the growth rate for permits for women has been like something like 110% faster than for men.
Mhm.
And the growth rate for blacks, I think, has been something like about 125% greater than for whites.
Right. Last question. You're in Australia. It's actually been 30 odd years since you last came to Australia.
Right.
What is it that you're hoping to achieve? Why does someone like you bring a message like yours halfway around the world? And what would you like to leave with us before you go?
Well, I mean, as somebody who's looking at this and I read media outlets in Australia, it just strikes me kind of the gap that people have between what's actually happening and what they hear all the time in the media. We talk about what the crime rate is. I talk to people in Australia. They have this belief that somehow crime is very low here in Australia compared to other countries. That's simply not even remotely true.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you take and the thing is, I just don't understand. I mean, I know the media is lazy on lots of things. Um, but, this is published data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics to go and look at the estimates of, the survey estimates of crime. And they can see the big gap that exists between uh, the reported crime and what the total crime is going to be there. And there are other things, even that I have to say, I mean, I could go into the weeds on it. There are other problems with their survey that I could talk about. But uh, you know, I want people to be safe. And my heart goes out. Last night, I was talking to some people who were at the Bondi Beach shooting. Um, because of the work I do, I've talked to people who have been present in mass shootings in Europe, in the United States, around the world, in South America. And, the feeling of utter helplessness that people have. I mean, these are people who are going to be having nightmares for decades afterwards. Uh, and you want to try to help them in some way. And I see things like the fact that the government won't let the Jewish groups have armed security that's there. It's just crazy to me. I mean, the government can't guarantee their safety
No,
on this stuff.
clearly not.
And so why won't they even let the people go and defend themselves and protect themselves? I'm not even saying even just regular citizens, just let this trained security people be able to go and have guns for protection. I mean, I'd like to have it broader than that, but at least do something like that. And so, I mean, I guess if I can try to save some lives or make people safer, it's, I don't have all the data I'd like to have for Australia. I'll give you one example with regard to the UK. We talked about UK earlier. So the burglary rate in Australia is like 3 times higher than the burglary rate in the United States. Now, in the UK, it's about twice the rate in the United States. But there's something that the UK and the US and some other countries have data for, and that's something called hot burglaries or residential robberies that occur while the residents are at home.
I see.
And so the UK not only has a burglary rate twice the US burglary rate, but 60% of the burglaries occur while the residents are in the house. In the United States, it's 13%.
For obvious reasons.
Right. Well, and more than that. So do you know what time most of the burglaries in the UK occur?
I would assume at night.
Yeah, they occur basically in the evening, like, 9 o'clock, something like that. In the United States, burglaries take place at about 2 in the afternoon. And one of the reasons, and also I'll just mention, American burglars spend about twice as long casing a home before they break in, even though it's at 2 in the afternoon. The reason why they're doing it at 2 in the afternoon is people most likely be out and won't at home. The reason why the UK burglars want to go and do it in the evening is so that people will be home,
Keys to
so
cars, things
so
like
they
this.
can force them to tell them where the valuables are in the house. But it's the way you avoid getting shot in the United States if you're a burglar is to make sure nobody's home. So you pick the time of day and you case the home to make sure, and you're willing to forego the ability to have somebody tell you where the valuables are, just because you're worried about getting shot.
Well, that certainly touches a nerve here in Australia. We're seeing a wave of home invasions and burglaries, particularly in Melbourne, but it is an Australia-wide problem. And they are doing that. They are targeting when they know people will be home, specifically to get the keys to cars, and as you say, to extract the location of valuables. I think what you've had to say today is very, very valuable for Australia. I thank you for travelling halfway around the world to come and talk to us, and I thank you for coming on the Topher Project.
Well, it's nice to visit your beautiful country. So thank you.
John Lott, a pleasure.
Thank you.
That was John Lott Jr, and I feel very privileged to have been able to sit down with him for over an hour for that interview that you've just watched. My name's Topher Field. This is a Topher Project special event, and if you appreciate what I'm doing with the Topher Project, then I'd really appreciate you helping me to keep going so I can bring you more stories, news, perspectives, and interviews like this one. You can support the Topher Project by heading over to topherfield.com, head to the homepage and buy me a coffee via the button that you'll find there, or click on the shop, check out my books, DVDs, my t-shirts, hoodies, caps and stickers, because everything that you buy is going to help me to keep making more videos in 2026, including more special event interviews like this one with John Lott Jr. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. The algorithm loves you, and so do I. Please make sure that you've liked, subscribed, comment your thoughts on this interview, and of course, as always, think free.